Gary McGee is an ordinary guy. He's not a famous superstar or a rock star or a sports star. But he did something very extraordinary the whole of last year. A mind-boggling thing that even after he did it, people are still not able to comprehend the significance of it. He spent every day of the last year running a full marathon. 365 marathons in 365 days. And he doesn't even know that's actually a Guinness World Record. He didn't run because he wanted to break a record. He didn't run because he wanted to be famous. He didn't run because he wanted to show his endurance skills or ability. But he ran because he wanted to raise $1.4 million for two charities. And the two charities, which he ended up doing at the end of the year, and all while still holding a steady job. And he battled sickness, he battled heat, he battled snow, he battled rain. He never gave up every single one of those days so that he could raise this. And when people asked him, why would you do that? And he had a personal reason. The money he raised, one half of that went to a cancer center that treated his father starting in 1997. And the other half of the money he raised went to the hospice center that enabled his father to live a few extra years before he died. This was his way of showing that he really, really loved his father. This may seem very bizarre and very extreme, but here is someone who really demonstrated his love for his father, not by just sending a greeting card on a Father's Day saying Happy Father's Day and then forgetting about them the rest of the days. Not by just taking care of some ordinary things for him, but he wanted, even after he was dead and gone, everybody knows how much he loved his father by what he did 365 days a year. Now, we are in a passage that was read to us today. It's a very simple passage. It's a very profound passage. As I was preparing this, I brought my kids to work. It's one of those bring your kids to work day. I get to choose when I do that, unlike your companies do. And Sophia came along, and she was reading my sermon notes and the text, and she understood it. And I asked her, what do you think he talks about? And she said, faith in action. And it was like, that's exactly what it talks about. So that's the title of our sermon today, picked by Sophia. So it's as simple as that. Children can understand it, right? Nothing very big, but it's also very, very profound and central to what would qualify you and I to be called as God's children. The whole book of James is talking about what is true religion. And if you and I call ourselves as Christians, how can our lives reflect authentic Christianity? It's sort of like a roadmap for personal revival. So he starts by telling so many things we have journeyed through so far, things that mark the life of a godly person, how we endure suffering, you don't cave in, how you develop character, how you persevere under challenges, how we stay pure in life in chapter 1, obedience to God's word, compassion for those who are needy, being impartial. Eric spoke about that beautifully to us last week. And he goes on to talk many more things we will cover. He talks about taming the tongue. He talks about humility. He talks about the power of prayer, being patient, and all of those things. But today is sort of a commentary on this whole book. He says, faith in action is what matters to God. He's writing to a bunch of Christians who are living all over the world, and they are not the majority people in any of those places. And he's trying to write to them to say, your life should be conspicuously different than the lives of those around you in all those different countries which have different worldviews and different ideologies and different challenges. And as I shared earlier, James is fascinated by the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus preaches. So this is his own commentary of his half-godly brother Jesus, where Jesus says, "Let your light so shine before men that they may glorify God, your Father in heaven." The key word there is "so shine." So James is unpacking that and asking his readers, is your life so shining brightly before all these different people that when they see you, they're drawn to love Jesus? And it's along that note he is writing this. He's writing it to encourage his believers to say, Christian life is also like a daily marathon. It's not a one-time deal where you raise your hand in some meeting as a Sunday school kid or in college, and then you just try to put cruise control and everything happens. You got to be in God's word every day. You got to spend time in his presence. There's certain things you need to do so you can run your life so people can know who you really love. And that can only happen by a faith in action. So in this brief passage that we read, he gives 4 illustrations I'm going to walk us through to drive home 3 main points. He talks about 3 types of faith: a dead faith, a useless faith, and a living faith. He's talking about a dead faith, a useless faith, and a living faith. In chapter 2, verse 14, he begins by talking about a dead faith, which according to him is a faith without works. What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? To James, if you say that I have faith, but then there is nothing in your life to exemplify that, especially to those in need, your faith is as good as dead. So he gives a very simple illustration right after that. In verse 15 onwards, it says, if a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. Now, why is he calling it a dead faith? Why is faith without works dead? Because the opposite of being dead is being alive. He says if you're going to have an authentic faith, it has to be alive to the needs of those around you. And if that is not happening, he says you have a dead faith. Because if you're only alive to yourself, and you're only conscious, alive is being in touch with or being in conscious with, if the things that are on your mind is only always about your needs and your comfort and your things, which is the reason why you're not thinking and you're alive or sensitive to the needs around, your faith is dead. Because you can't have Christ in your hearts without feeling like Christ for those who are around you. It's an oxymoron. If you're only saying, I don't have time, and whatever excuses we may give that we are not bothered about the brokenness around us, it's because we are only conscious or alive to my family, my children, my career, my comfort. Beyond that, if I have time, maybe I'll do something for God, as though God wants our help. The reason it's a dead faith is because not only is that we are not conscious or alive to only ourselves, we also have put our faith in those things which we think keep us alive in our relationships, our jobs, our or how we look or whatever we need. Our faith in these things trumps our faith in God, and therefore he says it's a dead faith. He's calling your bluff. He's calling our bluff. And as a Christian, if we are living in a place like Silicon Valley, which everybody knows, despite being the most richest, affluent place on planet Earth, is the least philanthropic place. People don't care to give, to take care of the needs of others. And as Christians, if we are living here, how will someone who is not a Christian know that you and I are Christian? Is when we show our sensitivity and needs to the broken, to the lost, to the suffering around us, locally and globally. And this is something that's really been on my heart. We have our boys' home, our Spectrum Boys' home, back in India. We have around 10 boys that we've been supporting, and I'm so thankful to all your generosity that we've been able to take care of them even through the pandemic. But let me ask you this. I'm sorry if this comes across too harsh. I'm trying to translate James' words in our church terms. It's wonderful that you all give money. How many of you know the names of those 10 boys? How many of you pray for those 10 boys in your family prayer? How many of you dream about those 10 boys and their future? Because it's not just throwing money at something that shows we care. How many of you spend a day with them when you visit India? How long will it cost? I'm so thankful some of our friends have done that. You know what brings cheer to the boys? I don't think they even know how much money we give and all of that. But when you go and just hang out with them, you play a game of cricket with them, they know you love them. That's all they need. They just need love. And I'm glad some of you have done that. Pastor Tad and I, when we visited, we even broke a window playing cricket. And someone from our church donated a cricket kit for them. I was so happy. It was more precious than gold to them, getting that cricket kit. And the dream I have is I want these boys to come here, study here in the same schools that our kids can study in college, and perhaps come and worship here at Spectrum one day. How awesome would that be? But we can love them, right? Show some love for them. We're starting Kids Club this month, God willing. It's taken a lot of efforts. And I was just looking at the sign-up sheet. There's like 4 or 5 people who signed up. These are the 5 people who sign up for everything in our church. And I'm thinking should I even tell them maybe you shouldn't because you're just doing? I'm like, what happened to the other 95 people? Oh, we don't have time. Our jobs, it's layoff season, man. I can't go and take care of these kids. My job is at stake. Rubber meets the road time, guys. I'm not trying to guilt trip any of you guys, but I want to ask you some straight questions. And God knows your heart. I'm no one to judge, but God does. And suburbs, it's become, sadly, many churches have become short-sighted to the needs of the community around, the brokenness around. It's just become about babysitting wealthy, affluent families and make sure the marriages are okay, the kids are okay, and they have a nice worship experience on Sunday. But the religion, true religion, we spoke about that a couple of weeks ago, God says, is those who care for the poor and the needy. That's not the gospel, I get it. We're not preaching a social gospel here. But if you have the real gospel, you need to care about these things. Is your life showing up? Is the question James is challenging. This text created a lot of tension in church history. In fact, Martin Luther himself was very uncomfortable with the book of James. He was like, no, this sounds like he's saying you have to have good works to show you're justified. No, it's not. It looks like he's contradicting the letters of Paul, especially the letters that Paul wrote to Romans, where he says justification is by faith alone. No, he's not. Because you know what? Paul and James actually sit and hash this out in Acts chapter 15. He knows exactly what Paul is talking about, and he knows the emphasis Paul is speaking, and he wants to emphasize on this aspect of what authentic faith really is. So he says, if you are not alive to the needs of the brokenness around you, your faith is dead. It's a dead faith. That's some harsh words, isn't it? So the next faith that James moves on to talk about, after he gives this first example of, if there are poor people, if you just tell them be well and don't do anything, is a useless faith. I'm just lifting words straight out of the text that James uses. He says in verse 18, it's a works without faith. So the first one is faith without works. Now is the second one, you flip it around, it's works without faith. The other category, right? But someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. And then he gives a very scary illustration. He's just so head on, man. Verse 19, read with me, please. Otherwise, I don't want you to think I'm making this stuff up. Verse 19, you believe that God is one? You do well. Even the demons believe, and guess what? And shudder. Do you want to be shown, you foolish person, that faith apart from works is useless? So there's our second subtitle. Who is he talking about here? He starts off nice. He calls them brothers, and now he's talking he's using a word like foolish, and it's a rhetoric that he's using. This is another category. He says, okay then, so what if I just do a lot of good works and, make this world a better place, and for all the bad I do, I try to do more good, and that will take care of it. A couple of weeks ago, I was sharing the gospel with someone, and this was one of the things that came up. And it's okay, when I do some bad things, I can do some good things, and that should be okay. It's real. In fact, that's the premise of most of the world's major world religions, whether it's Hinduism or Islam or Buddhism or Jainism or Sikhism, several of which came out of our Indian subcontinent, come straight out of this. They all believe there is a God. They all believe, and in fact, some of them, the Judeo-Christian and Islamic, Middle Eastern religions, believe there is even one God, and they actually shudder in the sense they even punish themselves, hurt themselves, and all of those things. But James says it's a useless faith. Jonathan Edwards, he's one of the early Puritan preachers. He's someone who's influenced even many contemporary preachers today, like John Piper and R.C. Sproul and D.A. Carson and others. So he preached a sermon on this verse. And you know what the title of that sermon was? True Grace Distinguished from the Experience of Devils. That's how they had titles those days. And when it comes to this verse, his sermons are always very intimidating when you read or hear it. He's not a very charismatic speaker. He just speaks in a monotonous voice, slow. He's very thin-framed, but his words are always very powerful. And when he comes to this, he says, let me show you two things demons have that are fine. Let me show you two things demons have that are fine, that are perfectly good and wonderful, that they are fine. He says, I want you to see you can have them and still just be a demon. There's nothing wrong with these things, but having them doesn't mean you're even more than a demon. It doesn't even qualify you more than that. What are those two things? He says, first of all, sound doctrine. This is where it gets kind of scary. He says, you believe God is one, so do the demons. Then Edwards goes on and he points out the devils have been to the absolute greatest seminary in the universe. He says the devils have all been to the greatest divinity school. They have been in the heaven of heavens. They've been in the throne room of God. They know more sound doctrine. They know more about God than the greatest saint who has ever lived. There's nothing wrong with that, Edwards says. There's nothing wrong with that. Get all the knowledge you can, get all the accuracy you can. That's fine. He says, but you have to realize that having that doesn't necessarily qualify you to be anything more than a demon. You can be a demon and have that. Then he goes on one step further and says, the demons believe that, and says James, and they shudder. Here's where Edwards gets really close. He points out, do you see? They don't just believe this. They respect the power of God. They respect the greatness of God. They're scared of God. They know what He can do. They move about, you might say, basing their lives on what they know about what God can do. He says if that's true, then it's very possible for human beings to know God is great, to believe God is great, to be scared of punishment, to be afraid they'll be punished, and even to alter your behavior and become a very moral person. That's what the world religions do. Even an incredibly moral person, even an incredibly religious person, says Edwards, and all of your religion and all of your morality is nothing but shuddering. You know there may be a God. There probably is a God. Or you certainly can't prove there isn't a God. And you know if you displease a God like this, you're in tremendous trouble. Therefore, you'd better start to do these things. He says it's possible to have an incredible amount of morality and religion that's nothing but shuddering. He says all it does is qualify you to be a demon. Wow. And that's why he says it's a useless faith. And the reason he says, oh, foolish person, because the Bible doesn't use the word fool in the way you and I use in a derogatory sense, questioning someone's moral, cognitive capabilities. In Proverbs, it says, a fool is one who says there is no God. He says you can have all these understanding, the right understanding. You may even fear. In fact, many people don't even fear as much as the demons do. But that faith is useless. And then he moves on. He's now set the stage for us, telling us what a dead faith is, using an illustration of caring for poor people. What a useless faith is, bringing the illustration of demons and their spiritual capabilities. And now he moves on to the title of our sermon. What is faith in action? He says that's a living faith, the faith that's alive. And he gives two illustrations from Old Testament to help us understand what this looks like. Two characters. Let's read that. Was not Abraham, our father, justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness, and he was called a friend of God. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. And in the same way, was not also Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way? For as the body apart from the spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works is dead. He talks about what a living faith looks like and gives us two beautiful illustrations of two very diverse group of people, representatives of people. The first is Abraham, the Jewish patriarch. He's the father of the Hebrew people. The second is Rahab, who was not a Jewish person and a prostitute. And both of these people, if you look at their moral standards, they were very, very imperfect people. Abraham lied a couple of times, committed adultery, marrying another woman called Hagar before he could have Isaac. There's nothing moral about that. There's nothing spiritually great about that. And then there was Rahab. You don't even have to know further. It says she was a prostitute. She was living on the city walls. That was what she was doing. Why does James pick these two examples from all the other examples that he could have picked to describe to us what a living faith is? Though we can talk about so many things of their life, there's only two specific incidents that James focuses on about their life that demonstrates of how their faith is real. For Abraham, it says that when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar, that's what made his faith active. That was faith in action. These two people actually did something to show they had real faith. And you know what that something was? There is a commonality between these two things. That's what we have to hone in on. They both were able to let go of something very, very dear to them and important to them. Something that normally, or until then perhaps, without knowing God, they had put their whole trust and faith on. For Abraham and Sarah was about having a child. Till 100 years, you don't have a child. That just becomes a very obsessive, compulsive, passionate need. God, you have to give it. And then when finally God gives in a miraculous way, it's so easy to hold on to that, to live for that child. And Abraham had seen something all this time. He had seen that God promised him this great nation of Canaan and told him to go, and he was never faithful. He kept lying his way through everywhere, telling his wife was his sister, and then ends up caving into his wife's, pushing him to go and commit adultery and marry another woman and have a son who was born, and the whole nation comes out of that. That's really been in history a very tumultuous place till today. But what he saw was, despite doing all these things, this God still loved him. How crazy is that? He says, I'm such an imperfect guy. I'm a guy who is always trying to get the easy route, and there is this grace of God for me. He still is giving me a son after I did all these things. Wow. And there is something that happens inside him, his faith, which is still now perhaps just a cognitive thing or something based on 1 or 2 or 3 experiences. He transcends all of them. And you know what happens? It says that he became a friend of God. Well, that's fantastic. God made him his friend, and he made God his friend. When you have someone you know that person is your friend, you know how you know that person is your friend? You think about yourself, your own lives. Who would you call today if you go through a sudden life crisis? And why would you call that person? It's going to be your friend. Because you know this person loves you no matter what. You know, even in the middle of the night, if you call this person, he will show up and be in your house. You know, this person is not going to judge you or evaluate whether you've been a good person or a great person, whether you have money, you don't have money, or you have a job, or what job you have, or you have a car, or what car you have. You know you've crossed all that. And therefore you have this trust and faith in this person. And you would call them, right? So when Abraham was able to have that experience, and he says, this God who is now my friend, if he tells me to sacrifice my son, I'm still going to do it because I love this God. And he tells, if you read we don't have the time now to go through those chapters in Genesis, if you read that, he tells his servants, before he goes up the mountain to sacrifice Isaac, I will bring him back because he knows how awesome his God is. His God is not a bloodthirsty God like the pagan gods who is going to drink the blood of his only child. He wants to now show this God that he loves. He says, I'm going to give to you, God, whatever it was that I have been putting my faith in because I just love you. That's living faith, faith in action, explosive, mind-boggling action. And Rahab, she doesn't even know much about this God. She's not even a Jew. All she has heard, if you read her account in Joshua, she lives in Jericho on the walls. You all sing as kids, the Battle of Jericho, the VeggieTales song. Unfortunately, that's the one where the focus goes and how you go around and blowing the trumpet, the wall came tumbling down. That's not even the biggest deal, guys. She's staying there. She says, I heard about your God to the spies who come there, of how he helped you cross the Red Sea. She gets all the things that she has heard about who God was enough for her to make that switch. Well, I'm going to trust in this God. She has never seen a God like that. She hasn't even seen any human relationship like that. That's why she's in the kind of profession she is, searching for the true love. And when these spies came, you know what she's willing to do? That's not a profession you can be very proud of, and you can be safe. And when you are in that profession, you have to be very careful with what you do. She knows that if she is found out, she'll be immediately put to death. She's willing to let go of her own life. She's in that profession because she wants to provide for herself. She's in that profession because she thought through that was where she's going to get her security and safety and whatever else is needed. She's going to let that go and save these spies. It's fascinating why James very specifically picks only two people, and even in those two people, just the specific act to tell them, that was a big action, guys. Both of them were able to love God so much, to trust Him, to do this. And how wonderful it is when God sees us doing that and He calls you as friend. This is the bottom line. Jonathan Edwards says in his sermon, this is what James is trying to see. He says, do you want to see the difference between a dead faith and a living faith? A dead faith may obey God for what you get out of it or what you avoid. That's shuddering. I want to believe in God because I want God to give me this X, Y, Z and a laundry list of things. Or I want to believe God so that, I don't lose my job and my kids don't turn out to be unbelievers and this and this and this and a lot of them. That's just shuddering. It's possible to be very religious and your religiosity is just shuddering. It says true faith wants friendship with God. True faith longs for God. Jonathan Edwards says, false faith can see the holiness of God, can see the wisdom of God, can see the greatness and power of God, can even see some of the love of God, but the one thing false faith can never see, he says, is the loveliness of God. I love it, how he uses that word. True faith wants to please God, not because of who He is, not for what you get, not for what you avoid. He says you want this friendship with God. On that day when judgment happens and when Christians come to see Christ's divine loveliness, it's not difficult to see how the blood of Christ becomes so precious for us. When you see the beauty of what Jesus has done, and when you come to long for it, you see the preciousness of Christ. That you're saved by grace alone. No matter how bad or great your life was, it didn't matter to God. It never counted to God. And when you see that, you see the loveliness of Christ, that He's now my advocate, He's now my mediator. And when God sees me in Him, He sees me as His friend. That's an exotic thing. God was after Abraham's love, his heart. says, I want you to love me first, Abraham. That's living faith. I want you to respond to that. I want you to let go of whatever reasons you are giving to hold you back from being alive to others. I want you to first come alive to me and embrace me as your friend. Unless we come alive to God and have this friendly encounter with Him through Christ, we're not going to be alive to the needs of others. But once we become alive to God in this way, all those reasons we have kept that shows how we have put our faith in that, we'll be willing to let go. Let go of that. And you know why? Just like how Abraham took his son Isaac up the mountain to offer him as a sacrifice, God the Father took his son Jesus Christ up a mountain, and this time He did not withhold. He unleashed His wrath on him and sacrificed him for your sake and my sake. That's divine, unearthly love. That's how He made you and I to be friends with Him. And when that clicks, He says there should be nothing that withholds us from showing our love to those around us who are not as privileged as we are, who do not look like who we are, who are going through pain and suffering and brokenness in this world. And we will not come up with a list of excuses to say, I can't do that if you have had this. We no longer care about our safety and our future and our provision because we see this Christ who was Abraham's seed. We see this Christ who came in the ancestry of Rahab. She's listed in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Wow. Her faith not only helped the nation of Israel to get into the promised land, her faith eventually paved the way for Christ to come to help you and me to go into the final promised land. If God showed His love in such tangible ways, it's only fair that He expects us who want to be called His friends to do the same, isn't it? And Abraham, the gospel he received was that he will be the father of many nations. That hasn't changed. Jesus said the same thing. You'll make disciples of all nations. That's the mandate of our church today. That's why we are called the Spectrum Church, because we want to disciple people from all the nations who are right around us. But if we keep saying, oh, I can't, do these things because I have this, this, and that, then we need to take that to God and ask ourselves, how real is my faith? Which of these three faith aspects defines me? Do I have a dead faith or a useless faith, or is my faith in action? It's time to act, says James. And whatever it is that we struggle with as a reason to not care for these broken people, to care for the injustice happening in this world around us, whether it's our security, our safety, our own needs, we can go and crucify it on the cross. That's the thing that we need to crucify. Paul says, for me to live is Christ. Whatever is great, I count them as nothing but loss compared to the surpassing nature of knowing Jesus, my Christ. And when we do that, the world will take notice, and we will make a difference.